welcome back to another episode of the podcast. We have Katie back on this morning today. Katie was on originally in January of 2024, if I have my dates correct. So feels like yesterday, but it was over a year ago at this point, which is crazy.
No.
But in that podcast, we went over a pretty wide range of topics, her background, a lot of different things. So I don't want to spend too much time on the background today. I want to get kind of right into it.
Yeah.
A quick recap, though. If you want more of her background, definitely go back and listen to that. I actually reposted that podcast a few weeks ago. I had laryngitis when I was going to record, and so I couldn't post a podcast, and I knew we were going to do this, so I reposted our podcast so people could listen to it, kind of get a refresher. But Katie, she's an awesome PT based out of Miami, and also has a background in psychology and neuroscience, so I'm really interested to talk about that today.
Yeah.
And kind of go over the connection between neuroscience, psychology, and rehab, physical therapy, because I think that's a huge thing that not a lot of people outside of our space think about.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to touch on that a little bit. You also do still teach neuroscience. Yeah.
Yes.
I got a list of courses from some reviews of you. Everybody that's ever taken your courses had great reviews of you, by the way, online.
But that's nice.
I've got behavioral genetics, developmental neuroscience, drugs in the brain, and neurobiology of disease. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Good deal. That's fun.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun.
So yeah, I think you really blend the academic and clinical really well with your background. And I think it's kind of, you may not feel like it's rare, but I feel like it's a rare background to have because it is two different industries that are different, but also very supportive of each other.
Yeah.
And also the academic background, teaching still, you still keep up with kind of the literature to teach, but then you spend a lot of time clinically working with people. So I think that's a really unique background that I'm really excited to dive into more today and kind of share that with people.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I think as you said, being able to have the academic side and still kind of like stay up to date with what's going on. Neuroscience was my first love, and I feel like being able to still teach it keeps me in it even more. Because obviously, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, there's principles of neuroscience in everything we do from a training and rehab perspective. But I just like the nerdy side of it too. Like I want my developmental neurobiology, like I want to nerd out over the neural tube and how it all starts. Like it's really cool. I feel really fortunate that I get to kind of have like a foot in each side of the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's super cool. I came from it the other way. I started training and then learned kind of, simple things like how motor neurons work and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then got interested more in the psychology of things. And now I have a kid. So like child development and neurological development is super cool to me. And so I've come at it the other way of training and then getting really interested in psychology from like sports psychology, the neurology of things. So very, very much surface level knowledge for me though on that front. So very interested to talk about that. But could you first maybe lay out kind of high level the differences? I think your undergrad was psychology and behavioral neuroscience. So what's the difference for psychology and the neuroscience? Because some people may just lump that all into one thing, but they are separate fields of study.
Yeah, I think a lot more programs are becoming more interdisciplinary now and kind of including it all together. Like if you study neuroscience, you're definitely going to still get the psychology side of things. I would say I think the biggest difference in maybe curriculum standpoint, when you're studying psychology, you might not get as deep into just like the basic sciences. It's like a lot of anatomy and physiology and obviously neuroanatomy and physiology, looking at things maybe potentially more like the cellular level, or at least having an understanding of that, because on the behavioral neuroscience side of it, that's where like it's much more blended of the psychology and the neuroscience side. So thinking almost more of like basic science and getting into a little bit more of like the cellular mechanisms of things with neuroscience. And then the psychology part of it, it's a lot more behavior. It's a lot more human behavior. It's a lot more of the like social sides of things, like the psychosocial models of things. I think they're perfectly married together. I like to understand the cellular and like physiology side of things and then apply it to the behavior side of things. I think you kind of need them both. But there's so many branches and offshoots of each of them. One of the coolest things that I think, like, since I started studying neuroscience back in 2010, like the branches of it that exist now that didn't really exist before, or what people are interested in now, especially from like a human behavior lens, There's like behavioral economics and neuro law and like all of these different offshoots that I think are fascinating, and take us into the next level, I think, of just actually forming like a scientific understanding of things and not just having theories of why we think people behave the way that they do. I think they're quite linked. I think studying both just makes sense, but that's like, those are the main differences.
It really does kind of pervade everything too, from like a starting my business and things like that, marketing, like different fonts or colors elicit different
Yeah.
emotional responses. It's kind of insane how it underpins everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was first really like realizing how many different branches there were, it makes logical sense where it's like, well, of course we have to understand how all of this stuff works up here to be able to maybe relay that to the decisions somebody would make, or yeah, like even just what colors would potentially evoke a certain emotion. I think it's all super fascinating.
Is there a gap in like scientifically understanding mechanisms of action for things? Obviously, psychology, neuroscience, there's still a lot of work happening.
Mhm.
Like we know certain things like X produces Y with psychology, but is there still a big gap of like actually what's happening under the hood there? Because as I've dove into it, there's a lot of like existential things that it's like,
For
oh, like
sure.
what is consciousness even, right? And you go down this
Yeah,
rabbit hole. Um,
yeah,
so is that something we've gotten
absolutely.
better at?
I think we're constantly getting better at it, but I think the big takeaway can be just how insanely complex the brain is. And, we used to think that there was just like the part of the brain that's responsible for vision only, or the part of the brain that's responsible for this emotion. And the brain is just more about interconnectivity. And it's not necessarily only about like this region is responsible for this thing. And it's not as black and white. It's super complex, and the interconnectivity and the wiring across all areas of the brain and how it all orchestrates together. That's what's really interesting, but also hard to measure.
Uh,
So that's what makes it a bit challenging for sure. There's also taking super mechanistic data, like this happens cellularly in the brain, and then trying to impart that exactly to how people behave is also impossible, because there's so much variability in every single human that we can't only be explained by our neurons talking to each other. So that's what makes it confusing, convoluted, complicated, but I think really cool, and gives so many opportunities for things to learn, which makes me excited about it. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we don't know, especially really, as you mentioned, like more existential concepts like consciousness. There's debates whether it exists or not, because we can't possibly really know. The joke is always like, the brain is the thing that we named, but the brain
uh,
is what made us name it the brain. Like, it's just this like one of those things where if you think about it too long, your brain starts to hurt and you're like, okay, I'm also now having an existential crisis. But that's what excites me about it. That's what I think is very, very cool.
yeah, I don't want to go too much down the existential rabbit hole, but I was listening to an audiobook years ago and I stopped because I was like, I can't have this
This is too
existential
much.
crisis right now. But they were discussing when people have their parts of the brain separated and how they can
Yeah,
get the different parts of the body to say and write different things about like what they want to do when they grow up and stuff. And it
that's
was basically
crazy.
opening up the like, what is consciousness if you separate the
Mhm.
brain and it seems that there's like two consciousness. And I was like, I can't do this right now.
You're like, I'm done. I
Yeah.
don't want any part of this. Yeah, it starts to get a little bit uncomfortable when we think about that, because I think humans, we like to think we have a semblance of control, and it's like we're so complex, and we are such a weird mixture of like chemicals and environment, and like it's just impossible to predict human behavior perfectly, but we can try to use some of this information to create at least frameworks.
Uh, yeah, we're going to talk about it later. So I don't want to get into it now, but it is that kind of interesting how much is in our control versus how much is chemical processes in our brain that we think we're in control of, because we can say we can produce the environment that produces those or create the environment that produces those. But the decision to create the environment was itself created by chemical processes out of our control, right? But
Exactly.
I do have a kind of a related question, so we can get into that in a minute. But I
Yeah.
wanted to kind of set the stage for the importance of these concepts when it comes to training and rehab.
Mhm.
So can you kind of expand on or give me your thoughts on the statement that all injury is brain injury?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think of that because you could take that in like a very negative way, like, oh, we're all doomed. I think of it as any experience that we have is going to change the real estate in our brain. That's what plasticity is. When people talk about neuroplasticity, it's literally just the changes of connections in the brain based on experiences that you've had. That's why it happens more when we're younger, because we're super plastic when we're younger and everything is new and everything is shaping us. The cool thing is it does continue to happen despite what people have thought in the past. Especially in areas of the brain related to learning and memory, like the hippocampus, which is very cool. So that is a big part of it, like just how plastic we are and how all of our experiences shape what our future relationships with the world look like. And this becomes especially true for things that hold like a high context for us. So things that are holding a lot of context for us would definitely be pain and injury, because the brain's literal number one goal is to keep us alive. So when we have experiences that threaten that, how real they are or not, but if the brain perceives it as a threat, that's going to definitely change how we react to things in the future. And that's why it's really important to understand that. It doesn't mean that we're doomed, and it doesn't mean that pain is only in our head, because I think that's a way that you can take it in like a whole different direction that maybe is not as helpful for people. But I think if we at least understand that we are just a bundle of experiences and reactions to experiences and reactions and predictions to what we think a future experience will be, that really helps us understand why pain is so complex and why pain does leave a lasting impact on the brain. The great thing is we can use that plasticity to our benefit. If the brain changes with experience, well, then that's where giving people experiences with exercise and experiences with movement and training that go against what the negative things that they think will happen is so important, because we can create that new real estate in the brain and we can create new context for like a positive relationship instead.
Yeah, that neuroplasticity is it's always been interesting to me, but now that I have a 2-year-old, it's so apparent how many new neural connections he's formed. I did look it up. It's an insane number, but every little experience he has is so new and so much forming those connections in his brain. I think it was a psychology quote that like, show me 0 to 5 and I'll show you the adult, because of how important those years are. And it's just so apparent in my face every day now that how powerful that is when they're young, which is really cool.
It's cool. It makes it, I think, even probably more fun. I'm not a parent, but I would assume it makes it even more fun if you kind of think of it in that way of like, I can't wait to give my child all of these experiences because I know I'm just like making their brain robust and giving them exposure. Like, I think that's such a cool thing about being a human.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. I'm taking a night college class right now as a prereq for my master's, and he'll stand in front of the door and like not want me to leave, which is good for me because I spend so much time with him. But then it's also in the moment like, oh man, but then I have to remind myself like, no, now he's seen somebody work hard and he's learning that he doesn't get everything he wants, and there's repair and things like that, which are super important for
sure.
Emotional development. As kind of an offshoot, not really a super long convo, but as sort of an offshoot to this, I spend a lot of time in like the tech space. Cybersecurity was my undergrad, and then now obviously getting more academic experience in this world and coaching and things like that. I just kind of think a lot about the concept of getting smarter in any area kind of makes you smarter in every area almost. I don't know if there's much to that, but I kind of think like, even if I dive deep into something and learn a lot about it and then do nothing with it, those neural connections have like made me smarter overall and taught me new ways of thinking and just made me overall more effective in every area, because I've opened my brain up to that ability to learn and think about things in a different way.
1,000,000%. Yeah. I mean, that's why like brain training games are popular for older adults. It's to be able to continually, just like we do with training, progressive overload and gradually expose yourself to harder stimuli. Like, that's what learning is for the brain. And it is a skill. It is something to continue to work on. And there's absolute carryover with just being, even just like developing the critical thinking skills or the research skills to be able to do that, and then do that with other fields of study. Absolutely. There's also a lot about just like grit and the ability of like being uncomfortable with learning something new and the stress of that. And that is also a big component of it, just being uncomfortable. That's another reason why strength training in itself, beyond just the obvious metabolic and physiological benefits we get, if we also think of just like the mental effects that we get of putting our head down and doing hard stuff, pushing yourself when stuff gets hard, pushing yourself when stuff is kind of painful, obviously within the realm of what is safe for the person, disclaimer, but all of that too comes back to building mental toughness and like neurological and cognitive resilience. And I think that's a not often talked about form of, or reason why exercise is so important. We talk about it, of course, for muscles, but like for brain health, being able to do hard stuff, your brain likes that and your brain learns from that, remembers it.
Yeah, I think about this. I have friends that are AI researchers and things like that. And I think about this sometimes when it comes to outsourcing a lot of that. It may be faster, but you're not developing the ability to actually do the hard thing. And my wife teaches at
issues with that. Yeah.
My wife teaches at a Title I school, and you know, her first graders have the newest iPhones, and they do TikTok dances at lunch and recess.
That's so crazy.
And she'll ask them to write a paper, not a paper, you know, just like a little short story, a paragraph or whatever. And they just don't. They sit there like, I don't know what to do. They have no imagination because they don't have that struggle, which is really sad to see, honestly.
I agree. I think it's one of those like with everything new that happens with technology, there is that conversation of the pros and cons of it. And obviously we have so much more information at our fingertips literally than we ever have before, and that's huge. But the skill of doing research and the skill of looking things up and the skill of exploring things and defining things, I think it's invaluable. The skill of being able to write well, I also think is invaluable. And those are concerns that we're absolutely over time going to see neurological changes to support, well, I don't need as much real estate for this anymore. So which is that's again another, we're having a lot of existential crises before like 10 a.m.
I know, right? We don't have to dive too much into it, but you did mention neuroplasticity and the changes that happen in the brain. You kind of mentioned like more psychologically, you know, learning to stick with hard things, putting your head down. Do we understand like mechanistically the changes in the brain that happen during those experiences, or is it more so at this point just like we know psychologically you get these things from it, but we don't really understand why?
I think we understand a few things. So there is, interestingly, within neuroplasticity, which is about building new connections, that all happens with neurotransmitters and glutamate and a whole cascade of things that would bore everybody to death if I talked about. So we do understand actually like the mechanisms of neuroplasticity quite well. And then also there's another component of it that I don't know if people know as much about called synaptic pruning, which is the intentional decrease of neural connections for stuff that doesn't matter as much anymore, or for stuff that isn't as important. So that's, I think, a big part of it too. A more efficient brain has the connections it needs and no more and no less. The brain is all about conserving energy. So if you are able to, through the things that we've been talking about, if your nervous system and your brain is able to be very plastic and build stronger connections, it's just as important for it to be able to discard the stuff that doesn't matter as much and have that very good natural synaptic pruning process occur. So that's a big part of it too. It's kind of like the mechanism is a tug of war, kind of, with things that are rebuilding and getting stronger, and then things that are kind of don't need to be there anymore. And that's a part of it that it seems weird because we don't think of it that way. It's like, it seems like that would be bad, right? But it's actually a very efficient way of making sure your brain is utilizing the appropriate amount of energy and not doing any more, because that's taxing and that's not efficient for the brain.
Yeah, I'd read a post online about a undergrad psychology student or something who had kind of Pavloved himself, where every time he did something, he would like it was like he would have an essential oil by him or something like that to kind of show himself how that worked. But then afterwards, he showed himself the opposite of how he could unwire that by doing the thing enough times without the smell or whatever, or smelling the smell without the stimulus, to kind of personally experience that whole cycle of kind of, you know, that neuroplasticity cycle.
That's so funny. I like that, like using Pavlov as a verb. He Pavloved himself. That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, like what just makes this all so fascinating to me is like if we just think of our lives as collections of experiences that we're giving our brain and we're teaching our brain and we're building more real estate and we're creating context. I think it's so exciting. Like I think that makes, at least me, it makes me want to be a more like curious consumer of the world around me.
Definitely. I would agree with that 100%. Knowing, well, I guess to back up, when it comes to pain, this is kind of a big topic. We can dive more into it later, but how do most people think about pain? Because most people probably aren't thinking about the brain when they think about pain. And then how do you think about pain as it relates to some of these things when someone's having a pain experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common way people think of pain is a very like linear model of it. Like I did something wrong, I injured tissue, now it's telling my brain that there's something wrong. And that's a very almost like a reflex arc when we talk about how the brain gets information. There's very complex ways with tons of pathways and crossing over and things coming to the brain, the spinal cord, back and around and going back to our muscles. There's more complicated ways that we get information. And then there's a reflex arc, which actually doesn't really even go into the brain. It stays in the spinal cord because it has to happen really fast. So it's a really, really quick reflex to a situation. And that's what I think a lot of people consider as pain. Like, if this, then this. So if I got hurt, then this will happen. And we just know that it's so different than that and so much more than that because of the countless stories we have of people who step on a nail and don't know it until they go and take their shoe off later. And they had no pain all day because their visual system didn't even process it. So that gives us a ton of information of how complex this is. Or people who have chronic pain and they're having pain well beyond the window of tissue healing. Somebody who had a disc herniation 20 years ago, their disc healed at minimum within a year. So we know that physiologically those tissues have healed. So that takes us away from pain just being in our tissues too. So when I'm thinking about pain, I'm thinking about just the endless possible inputs and variability of each human being and their experiences and their own chemistry and how they could react to something and experience something. I'm thinking of how it changes how the brain responds to things. I'm thinking of it a lot from the psychological lens too of which we've talked about before too, of predictive processing, which is basically just a heuristic your brain uses to use past information to predict what's going to happen next. And there's evidence that people with chronic pain and chronic anxiety have impaired predictive processing. Their brains are predicting much more threat all of the time and relaying that information back and creating behavioral outputs that are more like what we see with people who have chronic pain, being really fearful of movements, being hyper vigilant and hyper aware of every little sensation their body gives them, their pain experience being intensified because they're more sensitive to pain. So we see that. All of that stuff plays a role, and that's what I'm thinking about constantly when I'm thinking of pain.
Yeah, that's huge and definitely relates to something I wanted to ask, which is, you kind of went into it already, how people's emotional state influences their pain experience. So, people are feeling emotions when they have an experience, feeling maybe sad, anxious, worried, depressed, things like that. What would you, I guess, posit is the cause of a lot of these feelings? Is it like these are things that they feel normally that then make their pain experience worse, or like the pain experience brings these negative emotions on?
Yes. All of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a chicken or the egg conversation. So the way I try to explain it a lot too is if we just boil down like what's happening from a chemical standpoint of what pain and stress are. And of course, that's not all of it, right? Like we're just talking mechanistically here and not even about like the experience and the human side of things. But if we think of like what the stress response is, for example, it's just a cascade of events. Like if you've heard of the HPA axis before, it's just these chemical and hormonal reactions causing one thing after another to happen to then create the behavioral output of things that are responses of like increased cortisol and changes it like hormonally. So higher levels of stress in general, higher sensitivity to pain, more worry and anxiety. All of these things are the byproducts of these chemical cascades of events. If we think of what pain is, it's basically having a stress response as well. So you're going through those same chemical responses and getting those same chemical and therefore behavioral outputs. So if we understand the physiology of stress, we can understand the physiology of pain and why the negative emotions we experience with stress are the same as that we experience with pain. You're just ringing the same bell. You're doing the same cascade of events over and over and over again. And that's where I think a lot of that overlap happens and why we get negative emotions from the stress response itself that feed into how we perceive the experience as well. If we're looking through the world with a negative lens, if our predictive processing is impaired to think that more things are a threat than they are, it's just like a constant feedback loop, if that makes sense.
It does. And I hear this from mostly people using it for marketing, honestly, to sell things more in the like kind of manifestation world. But there's this idea that the brain is filtering out 99% of the things that are coming in, consciously at least. I think they put numbers on it, like huge numbers, like your brain receives like 11 million bits of information and only processes 50 per second or whatever, right? And it's posited as like the brain is just the ultimate filter. And so kind of what you focus on is what you get because you filter out different things. Is that scientifically based, I guess, or is that more just like a kind of woo-woo marketing thing?
I mean, it's an oversimplification of it. But I think if we think back to synaptic pruning, it's a similar thought process of like more information isn't always better. Better information is better. So being able to peel back the things that don't matter as much and not waste the metabolic and energy expenditure of the brain is very, very important. So I think I'm assuming that some of these companies are trying to maybe extrapolate like that type of information. It's kind of like those movies where like they're like, you only use 10% of your brain and then they give you a pill and you use it all. Well, if we operate under the principles of neuroplasticity and synaptic pruning, your brain would have gotten rid of the 90% of it says you don't use because it would be an energy waste. So it's not as simple as like, we only use this percentage because literally the brain is smart and it would just kill off and synaptically prune the stuff you're not using. So it's not as simple as that, but I think that's probably where they're getting those ideas from.
Yeah, that makes sense. This idea of the brain being wired to be efficient, right? Our body's trying to be the most efficient. There's this concept of like psychosomatic experiences, things that happen kind of below the level of consciousness that still influence how you feel and things like that, right? Like some certain stimulus may cause anxiety and you're not even aware of it. I have some, I guess, questions on that, but could you maybe introduce that concept as a whole, like how the body can kind of have these emotional experiences without you even knowing that it's maybe caused by some physical stimulus that you feel? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are not always in our conscious awareness, but can still impact our physiology for sure. This isn't an area that I'm actually as well versed in and compared to a lot of the other stuff that we've talked about. But in terms of just like from my knowledge on the subject, yeah, I mean, if we think of there's regions of the brain that are like the higher up regions, the more cortical regions where you have a lot more of like your conscious decision making and judgment and things like that. And then lower level regions that are a bit more primitive and a bit more almost like survival mode and reflex reactions and responses to things, or controlling your breathing rate, things like that, that we're not consciously thinking of. So a lot of this is, if we can understand that there's a lot of things physiologically that we are not consciously in control of, like I'm not telling my heart to beat, I'm not telling my breath to happen, I'm not telling my hunger to occur or not. These are subcortical, more primitive structures of the brain. And so if we have that, there can be kind of an assumption that there's some emotions like that too, that are not maybe within our complete conscious awareness, or potentially over time we've repressed them because of they're not comfortable. They're not fun to feel. So that's like, that stuff for sure exists. I'm not as well versed in the mechanisms of it. But there's a lot of things happening kind of under the hood that we're not as like cortically in control of or aware of.
Yeah, I'd be curious kind of more clinically how this plays out. And I'll give two examples. So I myself had a near-death experience when I was in middle school and was hospitalized for like a month. So I've had a lot of like health anxiety that I've worked through. which causes a lot of experiences that are very clearly not actual experiences. They're all kind of psychosomatic. So that's been interesting to learn. Like, I share this because it's such a crazy example to me. I had laryngitis, like I said, a month ago or so, and I had a cough drop, went to bed, and was like, this will be gone before I fall asleep. And then I woke up coughing because it had gone down my throat, right? And I couldn't get it out of my throat. So I got up out of bed.
Gosh.
I went to drink some water, ate a banana. I'd been up for like 10 minutes, couldn't get it out of my throat. Finally, like, felt like it was out of my throat, right? I laid down in bed, I'd been up for 10 minutes, and the cough drop was sitting there in the bed. I'd coughed it out the very first time, but my body was like, no, it's still in there. It felt so real when it was just sitting right there.
Oh my gosh.
And so I think back to that whenever I have like a training pain experience or anything, because it's like, how much of this is an emotion and how much of this is reality?
Yeah.
And I have a friend who, he got really bad rhabdo in a selection course, a military selection course. It was exertional rhabdo, almost died, the whole thing, right? He's since run a 50K. He's since like done a 30-mile ruck. Like, he really is fine. But he recently had like a pain experience in the gym where he was back squatting and his quads felt absolutely horrible. And he was like, oh my gosh, I gave myself rhabdo again. I started a new training program, all this stuff, right? But he could deadlift fine. He could walk around fine. Like, his urine was clear. Everything is fine. But ever since then, he's had a hard time back squatting because his brain has this perception now of like, this pain in my quads is related to the rhabdo I had 5-6 years ago. And like, I'm going to die, basically. But it's all below consciousness.
It makes complete sense. And it, like, those are great examples because I think it ties to something very real and very rightfully something that somebody would be nervous about. I think the issue for a lot of people is when it becomes that level of health anxiety about things that do not warrant that much of a response. But the issue is most people, even us who are in the industry and this is our expertise, a lot of people do not understand that not all pain equals harm. And that's something that even us, we have the luxury of understanding the human body more than anybody we work with. Yet we still get into these traps too. And it just shows you how deeply rooted these things are. Again, it makes logical sense. It is smart for your brain to keep you alive and make you concerned about things that they don't want to happen again because something bad has happened in the past. So that's where I like using examples like that and talking to people like this about pain because it normalizes their experience. I like to tell people, like, of course you feel this way. Your brain is supposed to give you this information. The challenge now becomes, well, how do we kind of get you out of it? And how do we use this as an opportunity to rebuild your robustness and your resiliency and your tolerance of things that are difficult or a little bit scary? But I think like just humanizing the pain experience is very important and discussing it as like, no, this is an adaptation. This is a good thing. But when it kind of pervades every instance of our life or lasts a lot longer, then it's not as adaptive, but it's coming from a place that makes sense and that like every human being with an intact neurological system is experiencing this too. And I think that is like an aha moment for people because most people in pain, they think they're the only person that feels what this feels like because it's so isolating and it's so difficult to talk to people about. And it's not that we want to make people think that they're not important or their pain is not important, but normalizing it a bit and explaining like why it's a good thing until it's not, I think is helpful for people.
How do you help clients work through the process of understanding when pain is a problem and when it's something that can be worked through? Because as you said, we're always kind of processing, am I in danger? Am I not in danger? And gaslighting yourself when there is actual danger is a very bad thing. So how do you guide clients to that process when they come in with some of this background?
Yeah, that's probably one of the hardest parts because it's so subjective and individualized. And there's a few tactics that I try with people where part of it is like, I always tell them just being patient with the process of understanding what information their body is giving them. Because again, most people with pain, they haven't really been able to trust the information that their body is giving them. So that's a big part of it is just being okay with experiencing new sensations and that your brain is in a good way using that to like recalculate its expectations. So I like to set the stage with that. And then also Just some general things that I think help people, like especially with pain with exercising or pain with movement. If there's anything you're doing where pain is increasing as you continue or getting more intense or more unsettling, I would say that's probably a good sign that this is pain that maybe isn't worth pushing through, and finding a modification is going to make you feel better. I'm always careful to say too, like, it doesn't always mean that it's dangerous. It just means that maybe this isn't really the thing that you're ready for just yet. And your brain's giving you some information on that. And then also, like, do you feel very flared up after what you've done? Maybe not even in the moment, but the next day, do you feel really rough? That's probably another sign that, again, not always dangerous, but that what you asked your body to do, it wasn't quite the right dosage just yet. So I think centering it back on also that it doesn't mean it's dangerous, it doesn't mean it's bad, is important. And then also, I'll be very clear with people, if there are specific contraindications that would be dangerous, I will tell them. And I will say, I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying this more of like, there's only a couple things that wouldn't be the best option for you to do for safety. And here's what they are. Or here's the things that you would feel, or here's the sensations, or here's the things we're looking for. In the absence of that stuff, danger isn't what I'm worried about. It's more that, is this the dosage or the entry point or the progression that's appropriate for you or not?
Yeah, I think I learned this from you actually. And again, it's very individual on the client, whether they tend to push way too hard or not push hard enough. But generally giving people guidelines as far as, again, certain red flags around their injury. But then overall, like, if we can keep this at like a 3 or 4 out of 10, manageable.
Yeah.
But if it goes above that, we either reduce the range of motion, we reduce the load, we reduce the overall volume to a place that brings it within that manageable pain number. It, for the person, depending on them, if they're chronically overshoot, I might say like a 2 out of 10, because to them, they'll push even farther, right?
Yeah. You kind of have to play with and learn about that. And that's why, like, being so individualized is important, because a 4 out of 10 for some person is not appropriate, because if it's somebody who pushes themselves too hard, that's really like a 7 and they're like, I'm fine. And it's a lot for that person. So that's where the individualization side of it comes into play so much. And I always say, like, this is subjective and it's not perfect. And part of this process is we're going to overdo it sometimes, never in a way that's dangerous, because that's my job, is to make sure this isn't dangerous. But we're going to push the dosage sometimes and do it maybe when we're not as ready, but we use it as a data point and it gives us information and it becomes a target. And I think if you're just really clear from the beginning of that, it helps a lot. Most people, I would argue, one of the biggest problems with pain is that people feel out of control in their own bodies and they don't really understand what makes it better or worse. And we might not have the perfect answer, but if we can create an environment where we're understanding of how fluid pain is and we're understanding that this isn't a perfect linear experience, that at least hopefully decreases some of the anxiety for the person. So I think the most important thing with pain is setting expectations from the beginning that this isn't perfect. My number one goal is keeping you safe, and that's always what I'm doing. If we have flares, if we have things that occur along the way, my job is to constantly get that information and kind of titrate our dosage of what we're doing. And that's part of the process. I think that is very important for people to understand and be told from the beginning.
Yeah, when you're dealing with pain, understanding why things happen can, like you said, reduce the anxiety a lot, because it can become a little bit less emotional and you get a little bit more space between that kind of pain stimulus and your emotional response to it, because
For sure.
you can say, oh no, this tends to cause this and this is kind of a pattern, and like the 5 alarms do not have to go off. I'm not dying, something is not horrible, I'm not going to tear my ligament or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it too, of like creating space from the emotional side of pain. That's why I really like using movement as soon as I possibly can, because if we can find some things that are challenging for people that relate back to their pain experience, it helps them understand, like, oh, this is a movement that was really, really tough for me, but I could do it on the other side just fine. Maybe there's something to this. Maybe this isn't something that is, I'm doomed, I have this pain. Maybe it's actionable. Maybe it's related to things that I can improve upon, and related to things that I can at the same time build like systemic resilience and strength with. And that I think is important and cool too, to kind of utilize movement to show people like, oh, like this is really difficult. This could be related because, and we can maybe explain why. I think that also creates context for people and makes it maybe hopefully slightly less of like an emotional distressing thing.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that kind of action, taking action in these moments, because a non-fitness example that I like to think about is somebody with social anxiety. If this person has social anxiety and they avoid anything that causes them any form of anxiety, it can get worse. It can create this negative spiral where they avoid more situations because they feel more anxious. And then the more they avoid situations, they feel more anxious.
Yes.
And the actual way out is to get in some manageable situations that cause them anxiety and realize that they are safe and whatever they're anxious about is not going to be a problem, and kind of create that exposure therapy for them to get out of that. So kind of taking that example, when it comes to somebody in pain, I know we speak about these things a lot, like there's avoidance of the things that cause pain, there's fear around that. So can you kind of expand on that concept a little bit that you just introduced on taking action and building that confidence in their bodies and all of those things?
Yeah, I mean, what you just described is basically like emotional progressive overload. It's the same principle. It's just gradually exposing your body to more and more of a challenge, whether it's emotionally or physically, and your physiology actually changing because of that and adapting because it was challenged enough to have to make a change. And now it's better than before. It's super compensation. That's exactly what it's all about. And that's why progressive overload is so important beyond like our bro meathead lens of just like wanting to get jacked. It's also emotionally progressively overloading people. And I talk about that a lot of like, remember when I'm finding an entry point for somebody who's been scared of deadlifting their whole lives and we're finding a hinge that they can tolerate, I'm not just doing it for their tissues, I'm doing it for their brain too. So they're now slowly starting to unwind this association of this being negative and only bad. And they're building confidence with it. And that is huge context for the brain. That is something the brain likes. So that's a huge part of why I think is a non-negotiable, especially with pain and rehab, to come from that progressive overload lens, not just for our tissues, but for how our brain is responding too. That's also the argument too of like being as physically fit as we can because of the impacts of having more muscle mass, more aerobic capacity, and our ability to tolerate stress more. More Than Movement is an awesome PT kind of hybrid clinic in Philadelphia. And the owner, Nick Pagruni, he just made a really great post on this, basically about like our buffer. The fitter we are, the more of a buffer we have to handle stuff. And I think he had such a good like infographic kind of analogy of all of these things, where the more muscle mass we have, the more metabolically fit we are, the better our aerobic system functions, the more buffer we have to handle pain and injury, to handle emotional distress. So that's just another argument. Like, I want to build your buffer. I want to make you such a resilient human that these things maybe don't impact you as much, or because you're human, they might, but you can get out of it faster and you can get out of like the downward thought spiral faster.
Yeah, I'm very interested in like 10, 20 years, maybe the information we'll have on some of maybe the more mechanistic connections with emotional experience. Like we kind of look back at, say, like chemotherapy, and now we can target things, but we used to just kind of irradiate everything. And sometimes I think psychologically in the future, we may have more mechanistic data and be like, oh, I can't believe they used to do this for this psychological thing. Like they didn't know, but
for sure
it was kind of crude.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. That's like science is just over and over again being like, can you believe we used to do that? So I agree with you. I think that'll be very interesting for us to see. I think that's still always going to be the challenge with psychology, because you can't really isolate variables in the way that you can in more like bench science work. But yeah, I'm curious to see how that will continue to evolve, and even just what our understanding of pain is now. I mean, in PT school, I was still learning like the pain gate theory, that you're you're opening and closing the gate, and it's very, very basic and very, very like, again, if this then this type of situations. And we just know so much more now, like and it hasn't been that long. Like it's crazy how fast these things evolve.
Really, yeah, especially with technology and new ways to study things. Can you talk a little bit about, we've talked about a negative spiral a little bit. You share a graphic. I think Barbell Medicine has a similar graphic on their website on an article on this like fear of injury, which causes catastrophizing, which causes more fear of disuse and more injury, versus kind of the other side of things where it's like confidence, capability, and you get out of injury. Can you explain that loop and kind of what that looks like and how you help people get out of that loop mentally that they might not even realize they're in?
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, the way we kind of think of it is there's basically like two possible outcomes when somebody experiences pain, because we're all going to experience it. You have the pain event, you have the injury. You can go down arguably the most common route for people and have a lot of fear associated with that pain and injury, especially if there maybe was a movement you think you are attributing it to, or a position that feels most uncomfortable, or a position you've gotten information on in the past, then been told that it's bad to do. So we have fear around that movement and we stop exposing our bodies to it. When we stop exposing our bodies to things, the tissues become intolerant to those positions. They're never put there again. A great example that everybody I think can relate to is the deadlift. So if it's something that people have fear around and they're avoiding bending over, if we just think of it from a tissue standpoint, your back muscles, your glutes, your hammies, they're never really being lengthened and loaded and stretched and stressed in that way, fighting against gravity. So they become weaker. The tissues themselves become intolerant and they become weaker. Then inevitably in life, when you're going to have to bend over, it doesn't feel good. And it can maybe be a trigger or a flare. And it's less that the position is bad or dangerous. It's more that you now were put into a position you purposely were avoiding and detraining your tissues to. And you just asked it to go there. And your tissues are like, what the hell? We're not ready for this. So that is part of it. Then you add in that into the mix where the more pain avoidant people are, the less likely they are to engage in activity in general. So then you get wide systemic spread, disuse, atrophy, deconditioning in a more generalized term, that now their overall health is decreasing. And we know there's a relationship between poor metabolic fitness and health and the pain experience. So now you're creating this kind of perfect storm of being afraid of a movement turning into becoming much more sedentary and inactive. That starts to add even more so to the social components of it. You're not doing as many things and going out with friends, or maybe not as active in the community, and then depression and anxiety occur. So it's this whole spiral of one event or one movement that you became scared of that can really cause this whole, like, these downstream effects. And that can kind of just keep happening because, again, when you maybe are then presented with bending over in life and you get a pain experience, it's like, see, I knew it. I knew this was bad for me. I'm going to keep continuing to not do it because I knew it. I just fulfilled the thought that I had about it in the first place. That's what most people do in varying levels of extreme. The other side of the coin is what I think we would all like to do. Even us as a provider, we have hard times doing this. Getting your injury because it's inevitable, because we're humans, and confronting it instead of being afraid of it, finding the tolerable entry point, finding a way to continue to move and train around pain so your overall fitness isn't deteriorating during an injury. I have people all of the time who come in for injuries and I'm like, well, we have 3 other limbs, so we're still going to train. And a big part of the, especially acute injury process, is letting that acute inflammatory process happen and training the rest of the body and getting those systemic really good effects of training. So that's the route I want people to take, but it doesn't always happen that way. The challenge is helping people understand that. But I do think, which I've talked a lot about and talked with people like Craig Liebenson about, I think just providing experiences that make that happen instead of maybe trying to over-educate people on the process is really important. Craig talks about it as like violating people's expectations with exercise. And if I create an experience that completely throws away what they thought about it being dangerous, that's going to create more context any day than me telling somebody about it. So I think part of our jobs, my biggest goal when I'm working with somebody who comes in with pain is figuring out all of the things that they can do that are not triggers. Even if I don't get to the exact thing that I care about for maybe the thing we're going to identify for being related to why their pain is happening. If I create a roadmap of like, hey, here's what's safe, and this is really important to keep up with, that I think is very powerful for people too.
Yeah, it's building that undeniable real world evidence that their fears are kind of unfounded or not quite
Yeah.
completely accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It's so interesting to me how I see the overlap between like therapeutic things behaviorally too, where you mentioned somebody who never bends over, they get pain, and then they're like, see, I always get pain when I bend over. And, you know, psychologically things like that happen as well. If somebody has a certain belief and then they experience something that reinforces that belief, it's, oh, see, I'm right. I'm always right in this. And it's just so,
Exactly.
I just get so curious about it. It's so interesting. The more I, work with people, the more it's like, yeah, training and programming is really important and that knowledge is really important, but psychology and behavior is really the driver of most important things in life and training.
Absolutely. That's why I think it's so cool to have the background. And I've talked about this before where at first, when I decided to not go into the neuroscience research world and pursue physical therapy, my first reaction, obviously understanding that neuroscience is important for anything that we do from a medical standpoint, but my first reaction was like, did I just do all of that for nothing? Because it was such a rigorous type of study. Neuroscience, while being a collegiate athlete, is not a fun time. And the pressure to, especially then, like this is 2010 to 2013 time period, where I think it was still a bit more in the like publish or perish academia mindset, where like my goal was get as many publications as an undergraduate as I can, go to as many conferences and do as much research as possible. And it's grueling. I used to get off the boat at practice at like 7:45 in the morning and from Fort Lauderdale drive down to the University of Miami where I worked in labs and do research and then come back for classes in the evening. And like, it was just this constant rat race of like, I have to publish, I have to do all of this. And so when I didn't end up doing that, it was at first like, oh my God, what did I do all that for? But now I'm like, it could not be more clear that this is exactly what I should have done because it's so inextricably connected to what we're doing when we're helping people with pain.
It's so funny how things like that happen, where if in the moment when you made that shift, I'm sure if you could go back, you would have been like, oh, I should have done this before. Why did I spend all this time? Like you just said. But then now you can look back and say, no, this is actually the thing that made me kind of the superpower where I am, because I have this unique experience that a lot of people don't have, and I can really help people with this experience that I used to think was the worst thing I could have done at that time.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that's kind of, I think it comes back to the conversation of the things that are happening under our conscious awareness too. Like I know it can sound just kind of like cheesy, but I do think that there's so many things that we do in life that kind of culminate and lead us to a place that we are supposed to be. I know that sounds so cheesy and kind of silly, but I do think that. And I think having that positive lens on things, and ability to reframe is another like wildly important thing to be able to do, because like terrible stuff is going to happen. That's just what life is. But if we can reframe those situations and of course appropriately process and grieve and have the experiences that we need to have, but if we can reframe them down the line to like stepping stones in our journey to get wherever we're getting, like I think that's important too. And that's a concept with pain as well. Like we can reframe the pain experience of, well, we have an opportunity to build more resilience and robustness, or well, we have an opportunity to show you that you can get through really hard stuff. And I think that's very valuable.
Yeah, and even experiencing pain personally as someone who works with people just gives you so much more empathy for them, because you're still experiencing the same things they are emotionally, and you can sit with them in that and say, yeah, I get it.
Yeah, I think most of our clients think that we never feel pain. And I like to purposefully, when it's appropriate, right? We're not making it about us, but I like to share my own pain experiences to validate how normal it is, and to validate like even people who they think do everything right and our form is always perfect and all these things that they associate with pain. Like, no, it's so much more than that. I'm just a human being. The rule is that we will have pain. It's not the exception to the rule. And I think that's very validating for people too. It's going to happen and it's okay. But I agree with you. If you've ever gone a while without like an injury or a flare, and then you get one, And then you are reminded yet again of like, oh yeah, this does suck a lot. And it gives you even more empathy to handle it with people. I think it's a learning opportunity for us as providers too.
Yeah, I think it's why it's so important to have someone in your corner, whether a coach or somebody else that can kind of be that person outside of you to see the, you can't read the label from inside the box is what I say. So somebody outside of you can see what's going on, but also important for that person to be in the trenches as well and actually doing things. It doesn't have to be the same thing as you, but experiencing some of the same emotions. I wrote a post on it the other day, right? Like if you're a marathon runner, your coach doesn't need to run marathons, but they need to understand how horrible speed work on the track feels in the summer, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, when you don't want to get up, they're going to be like, I don't get it, man. Just get up and do it. But if anybody's ever done intervals in the heat on the track, they understand that nobody ever wants to really do it.
Yeah, being in Miami and noticing that that's the only option that I have is everything in the heat. I like to say I'm heat training, but it's just life at this point.
I know I'm dying here in Virginia Beach with this heat, and I'm like, we're going to Tampa next week for vacation, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to die running in Tampa next week.
Godspeed to you. It's going to be great.
Yep.
Yeah,
I was in Miami for a wedding, and they had a pool, and one of the girls from Miami was like, no, it's too cold to get in the pool today. And I looked at my phone and it was 85 degrees. And I was like, you freaking Miami person, dude. How can you say it's too cold?
We are so weak with anything that's slightly chilly or especially like cold water. I'm unable to tolerate cold water. We're just so spoiled. I'm like, the water is 78 degrees. Is it winter? Like, it's crazy. Yeah. The good thing is though, obviously this is a total tangent, but I will say having to run in such terrible hot conditions and humid conditions all of the time, any race that I travel for, I feel like a superhero. Mm-hmm. Like it can even be at elevation, it can be a lot of hills, stuff that obviously we're like below sea level in Miami, so obviously stuff that we do not have access to. But I do, and Alec Blennis talks a lot about this of just like the heat training and all of the benefits that carry over to training in harder conditions. I do feel that. So I try to reframe, think of it that way. But yesterday, for example, as I was running 6 miles in the middle of the day, I was like, I hate myself and I hate this, but it'll pay off for when I'm racing somewhere that feels less hot and humid.
Yeah, I feel like I get kind of the worst of both worlds, and not just me, everybody that lives in kind of a middle of America area like this, like northern of the South, because you get the cold, but then you have to heat adapt every year to the horrible heat and humidity. And,
yes.
And so like you constantly have to go through the cycle every year.
It's so true. Yeah. I mean, we just have no other option, but you at least get like this glimmer of hope. And then it's like, oh God, here we are again. I just got used to it not being terrible. That's so true.
Yeah. It goes from like, you get the fall, which is really nice. And then it can get down to like 30s during the winter, which is amazing for speed work and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you come back around to like heat indexes of 110 during the summer.
Oh, true. It's hilarious.
It sucks. So I don't want to go too much down this topic because it's a huge rabbit hole, but I did want to ask you, given that you teach a class on it's behavioral genetics, if I remember correctly. Yeah. It's a big debate even among people who like have PhDs in this and conduct research in this, but I'd just be curious your opinion as you work with people clinically and then teach this course and keep up with some of the research on the nature versus nurture debate when it comes to like motivation and people training and like that conscientiousness that goes into somebody having like a successful training program around work and things like that. Like how much do you think is inbuilt versus environmental, given what you understand about the research and then what you see day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to most of these questions is like it's always both. There are genetic influences for even physiologically muscle fiber type, proportions of people who have more type 1 versus type 2. There are polymorphisms and genetic influences for aerobic capacity and even just like being able to utilize like what I'm trying to think of people who are more successful at like getting blood delivery to their working muscles, things like that. There's also some genetic influences with people's ability to do hard stuff. Some of that is extrapolated by like pain perception and people's like there is genetic variability there. But at the end of the day, like it's so complex and so rooted in people's experiences and environment as well. I think you could create the argument in either direction of like somebody who potentially has a genetic predisposition to have more type 2 muscle fiber types, and they might naturally select to do activities that require more of that base. So that's part of it too, of like potentially these genetic influences that just cause people to select to do things below their conscious awareness too, that cater to their genetic abilities. So that's a thought of it. And then of course there's the opposite thought of that, of people doing these activities and therefore changing their physiology and changing maybe the expression of genes to match what inputs they're giving. So I don't know. It's like yes to all of it. That's why the nature nurture debate for literally every topic ever has been ongoing forever. And I think the safest answer is just yes, it's both. And we can of course have genetic components, but I would also err on the side of not making people think that they can be like genetically doomed to not be able to do things, that we should still give our bodies these different stimuli as well.
Yeah, what would you say to somebody who hears this debate and feels somewhat disempowered? Because there are people very vocal on both sides, but there are people pretty vocal about the genetic component to it, and people can feel very like, okay, why do anything at that point then if there is a genetic component?
Yeah, and that's where I think understanding the relationship between like we can't possibly explain everything for genetics. The epigenetics is the whole field of study where it's basically like our environment relates back to our expression of our genes. We can have these genes. It's just whether or not they're expressed. So that in itself is enough of an argument for it not only being genetically based. There's a big one where it's monoamine oxidase A or MOA gene, and it's a gene that you see in like serial killers. And a lot of people have it. But depending on your upbringing and your environmental background, it might never be expressed. So it doesn't mean that if you have this, you're going to be a serial killer. If you have this gene and you had a great upbringing and nothing that maybe would trigger traumatic events, it doesn't, the gene doesn't get turned on. And it's not by any means that simple, but that is a good example of it, of there's genes out there that are associated with not great behaviors, but not every single person in the world walking around with this gene is obviously a serial killer. So I think that's a good argument for it, where it's like our environment and back to neuroplasticity, the things that we give our bodies and our brain can shape what we do. And that's the argument for like not just saying, well, I'm not genetically set up for it. I think that is helpful in the explanation.
And it's the argument for I don't feel motivated right now, or I feel like I never want to train, therefore I'm always going to feel this way and I should just kind of get overwhelmed and give up now, versus the more I do this, the more I reinforce this behavior, and in the future this will be easier for me. Not that they won't ever experience these things, but this will be easier because I'll have built that habit and connection in the future.
For sure. It kind of comes back to just like the emotional progressive overload side of things. And it's like the concept of exposure therapy from the psychological lens too. But yeah, absolutely. Just that we are plastic and we are always changing, and we change based on what we're giving our bodies and our brain. And if we can start to whittle away at some of the things that are more challenging, the barrier becomes lower and lower and lower. At first, it's just the threshold is so great. Like it's so difficult to get past these things, and we just have to etch away at it slowly over time.
Yeah, so I have two like final questions for you, and then I want to, unfortunately, I didn't have a ton of time, but wanted to give you some time to talk about training equals healthcare because you have part 2 coming out and things like that. But two quick final questions. What do you think when you look at the future of training and rehab? What are you most excited about in the future when it comes to maybe new research or new things that are becoming accessible to the everyday person?
Yeah, I think I'm really excited for the newer generation of people in the industry who are not maybe only succumbing to the things that they learned in a textbook and realizing that human variability is great and psychology is a part of it. Like I'm excited by that. I think there's a really like fresh new take for how we're doing things, which I think is really cool. I'm also excited for, like it can be negative too, but I think I think what social media has done for fitness has been an overall extreme net positive. I think of like when we were growing up, I wasn't exposed to just like normal people training and working hard. I trained and worked hard because I played a sport. And that was the only really way that I was exposed to what like working out was. But now we have people who are learning about exercise at their fingertips and seeing it a lot. And I think even though there's a lot of not great stuff out there, I still think it's a net positive to just get more people exposed to exercise and learning how important it is. It's more so than we've ever seen in our lifetimes for sure. And I'm very excited by what that means for just like the future of this industry and how much it's growing.
I would agree. I had, so 2010, 11, 12, I was in middle school. So I did get some of the earlier, like, I didn't have this when I was really young, but I did kind of have it around that time frame, the YouTube and getting to kind of see fitness. And so I think it's really cool. I agree. I kind of got that in between generation period, which is cool. So then in the future, thinking about what do you see the biggest gap right now in training and rehab, and how do we bridge that gap, or do you even, how do you think the gap gets bridged, I guess?
I think a big gap is still just like overly fixating on pain and pain only in rehab instead of this is another thing that like Craig Leben said, and I talk a lot about using a pain experience as a window to help make somebody healthier. And that I would argue more importantly than like just this pain episode, most people coming to us have a lot of room to grow in terms of improving their metabolic health, building muscle mass, and improving their aerobic capacity, just getting their general activity up. And I think for a long time, that hasn't really been the focus or even touched upon in a rehab session. It's been very zoomed in on, oh, your knee hurts. I'm only addressing your knee, and this is what we're talking about. I'm excited and hopeful that that conversation starts to shift and we can start to be more in the rehab side of things, like healthcare advocates for why training is important, and healthcare advocates for why just zooming in on this one currently painful body part is a much, much, much smaller part of the entire picture.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So I want to give you a little bit of time to talk about training equals healthcare. I obviously went last year to yours, which was awesome, to part 1. And I signed up for part 2 in January. Very excited about that. So can you kind of talk about that and what part 2 builds on where part 1 kind of ended?
Yeah, so Training is Healthcare is a continuing education weekend seminar that I put together. And the part 1 version of it is based on more of the lower body and low back. So essentially big picture principles for how to manage pain, regardless of being a trainer, coach, or rehab provider, and how to find entry points and tolerable progressions for, and again, part 1, low back and knee and hip and foot and ankle, kind of regardless of injury. The whole premise of Training as Healthcare is basically once we rule out red flags, we're very free to be able to work with people and using patterns that we see in very typical presentations for knee pain, hip pain, low back pain, using that instead of being hyper fixated on a diagnosis to guide our decision making. Part 2 is similar, but more with like an upper body focus. I got a lot of feedback that people wanted a similar process, and diving a bit deeper into some program design things for dealing with people in pain. How do you create a program that's checking boxes of pain and rehab considerations while also getting a training effect? There's also going to be a little bit some business stuff in there too, because my business partner Frankie, who founded Old Bull, he's going to be working on some more of some business side of things too, because a lot of people who seek out these courses tend to be people who either are already doing their own thing, want to do their own thing. So we're bringing in some things that people have specifically requested, which I'm very excited about.
I'm excited to come. It'll be cool. It'll be a really good time. I travel up to York City. It'll be fun and getting to see you, and just very interested in the part 2, everything to learn there. So I'll put everything in the description as far as things, but Where can people find more about you, Training is Healthcare, Old Bull, basically all the ways people can find you, work with you?
Yeah, Instagram is always the best bet. My Instagram and Old Bull's Instagram, that's where we do any posts about upcoming events that we're having, continuing education courses, seminars, workshops, anything like that. So those would be the best places for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put those links in the description. Anything else you wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I mean, you always ask such good questions, and it's cool to see. I love seeing just the evolution too of all of your guests and the things that you're talking about with people. So just thanks for having me again. This is a lot of fun.
It's a good talk, and I could probably talk to you for hours on all the nerdy things, but
Same,
yeah, I appreciate
same.
it. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon. We'll probably definitely do this again, maybe next time earlier than a year, since it's been a little over a year at this point.
That sounds good. That sounds good.
Awesome. Appreciate you.